Hi everyone, this is Professor Benjamin. We have finished week 1 of our environmental conservation course and we are headed into week 2. Usually at the end of each week I have a video recording or even just a written roundup for the topics that we covered during the week and kind of a little preview into the upcoming week. So this week I just wanted to basically talk about some housekeeping items to start off with. Number one, please remember that each week by Wednesday 11:59 you have an initial post due for each session that we cover. In the summer sessions we typically cover 2 sessions per week because we have a condensed semester, and then we by Friday of each week, you have a required response post to a fellow classmate due by 11:59. And this is really important because it mimics that conversation that we would typically have in a traditional classroom. And I noticed that a lot of students fail to submit either their initial post meeting the requirements for their course, or they fail to submit a response post. So make sure that you are able to spend some time this week catching up on the requirements for this class, as well as trying to read and comprehend all of the material that is due for the sessions that are coming up this week. So this week, just very briefly, we're going to cover ethics, economics, and policy, and we're going to cover consumption and waste. So you'll have an initial post due for ethics, economics, and policy, and you will have a discussion post due for consumption and waste. Don't forget, usually always by Sunday night 11:59 you have quizzes due, and if there is a quiz related to that session, you'll find it right under the discussion post in each module. So this week I just want to go back and just review a couple of the items this week. Number one, in the introduction session we just covered kind of the basics of what we'll be covering this semester. There's just very basic information. One of the key important terms items that I want to talk about is number one, remember in ecosystems change is inevitable, and things are constantly changing. Number two, positive and negative feedback loops are really important, especially in the environment. One important thing you want to remember is that in terms of context understanding of positive and negative feedback loops, a positive feedback loop is actually negative to the environment because it actually exacerbates the whatever is happening. So for example, if the textbook gives the example that if we cut down trees and cause erosion, right, because the tree roots usually keep the soil stable, if we cut down the trees and increase erosion, then guess what? We increase erosion, which then increases more erosion because then that mud will fall on other, if it's on a mountainside, could then fall down onto the forests below, and then guess what happens to those forests? They then die. So it just exacerbates. That's what we call positive feedback loop. In a negative feedback loop, we want to return back to the sort of the original ecosystem. So they give the example of an algae bloom. So an algae bloom happens, or nutrients are added to a pond, and that can happen through fertilizers or detergent use, and then what happens is that gives the nitrates and sulfates to the plants that then cause them to grow. They then suck the oxygen out of that water system, kills all the fish, and then the algae die, the oxygen comes back, and then hopefully fish will come back to that ecosystem again, and then it starts all over again. So it is something that then transitions back to the original state, or sort of original state. And so this is how these feedback loops work, and really they're really important because they bring homeostasis to an environment. The problem is that when we throw them so far out of whack that they can't recover because of human influence, then there's an issue. Tragedy commons was the second thing that we covered this week, and tragedy commons is one of the main topics that translates through almost all environmental problems, and that's because most environmental problems deal with commons, which are shared spaces. And these commons can be really large or they could be really small. Large, we're talking just all of the world's air supply, water supply, land availability. And then we can move all the way down to like just a local park could be considered a commons in that neighborhood. One of the articles that really discusses this, well, in the 1800s, William Foster Lloyd talked about this, but don't forget, he talked about this in terms of population, because at the time that was the biggest concern, was that the population was going to expand. Now, of course, population is a concern, but also there's a lot of other issues related to commons, the use of common resources. And he then, and you'll see that in my PowerPoint, he used the analogy at the time that would really relate to the people. He used the sheep scenario relation. And his idea was that privatization would solve everything, because if you have ownership to something, it would work. And remember, the main concept of tragedy commons is the fact that humans have this inherent need for greed, and we look for our short-term interests in commons rather than looking at the long-term. We look for our short-term gains rather than the long-term interests of society. It doesn't mean everybody does that, but as a whole, it seems as if the human population does this. So in the 1960s, Garrett Hardin wrote this rebuttal to it, and he is the one who coined the term tragedy of the commons, and he wrote this article that defines all of the technical solutions that have been put in place to try and solve commons problems, but he highlights a lot of the problems with all of those issues, and that they're just these technical solutions, but unfortunately we need to add a moral component to these, and whether that's education or whether that is the fact that we need to actually somehow pull at the strings of people's freedoms, and he specifically talks about population a lot in his article as well, but this whole concept of tragedy of the commons, remember, again, bridges almost all environmental problems. And so that is the whole crux of Tragedy of the Commons, and it's a fantastic article. It's 32 pages. I know it seems overwhelming, but it is a wonderful article, and I think it's something that you should keep in your resource. And you'll actually cover this probably in more than one class throughout your time in college, or if you extend on to grad school, or even to receive your PhD. And then we talked about in this session a lot of other things. For example, we talked about how invasive species can be considered tragedy commons only when it deals with humans, because humans are importing them for their short-term gain versus their long-term interests. We could, although this has taken humans out of nature, meaning that we are not part of nature anymore, which is a whole nother ethical debate going on right now in the environmental ethical community that I am part of, is, are humans actually part of nature or not? And there's, we go back and forth as to whether we have now removed ourselves from nature to even be considered that, even though we're natural beings, because we can modify things at such a faster rate than any other species ever. But now I just use the word species, so we technically have to be part of nature. And so there's just a lot of questions as to, whether we are part of nature or not part of nature, but invasive species can be considered tragedy of the commons when humans bring them in for their short-term gain rather than their long-term interest. Now, if an invasive species, what we would consider in a natural habitat, meaning like a bird picks up a seed and implants it somewhere else, technically we don't consider that an invasive species with a tragedy of the commons undertone, okay? Because a natural process took that, and it wasn't in the exacerbated quantity as humans kind of have been able to interact with the ecosystem. And there's many examples of that. So this week, so I just wanted to review a little bit of last week. This week we will cover ethics, economics, and policy, and consumption and waste. So ethics, we're going to talk about what is a cost-benefit analysis and what are the problems with cost-benefit analysis in terms of the environment. When we implement policies, we always do a cost-benefit analysis. When I worked at the DEP, it was always required. It's an immense process. It doesn't always work out because, of course, in the government, we always kind of get in our own way. And one of the main reasons I left, because I just felt like I couldn't get anything ever done to help, which is exactly what I wanted to do. And so cost-benefit analysis, they'll talk about this. They'll also talk about, in the textbook, they'll talk about the different types of valuations that we use and the issues with those valuations. And then we talk about cap and trade, the story of stuff, both the story of stuff, which we'll cover in consumption and waste, and cap and trade. It can be a little bit of some frou-frou content in there, but overall it is, it just tries to get the point across, which is what are the problems with cap and trade and what are the problems with our consumption patterns, and how they're detrimental to society. Cap and trade article is here, and we also talk about environmental injustice, and the issues with environmental injustice. Environmental injustice used to be mostly based upon race, but now it's actually based upon, we're finding more and more that really environmental injustice hits people who have lack of education, lack of time, meaning that maybe it's in a low-income area where people have to work 2 and 3 jobs, so they just can't be involved in their community as much as they would like to be. And usually it is in areas of lower income. And so lack of education, lack of income, and lack of resources and availability for the people. So they might not understand the political process, so people take advantage of them. So there's just a lot involved with that. They might not understand the legal process and the steps that they can take in rewarding. And I worked on a huge case in Camden when I was at New Jersey DP, where the people of South Camden sued a sewage treatment plant that ended up in their backyard. It was slated for a all-white neighborhood, or mostly predominantly white neighborhood, close by, and people came out to those meetings and expressed their concerns, and guess what? They said, we don't want it in my backyard, and they moved it to an area where they knew they weren't going to get as much resistance. These residents sued and won, which was fantastic. But yeah, so this is ethics, economics, and policy, and then we'll cover consumption and waste as well. Like I just said, the story of stuff is a great video. It just, there is some misinformation in there, but other than that, it talks about externalization of costs, perceived and planned obsolescence. It also talks about this linear system. Remember, a linear system is a line, and when there's only an input and an output, and when this happens, it just ends badly because that output is never put back into the input. Now, if we were in a closed loop system where we worried about what happens with the product after we use it and where does it go after we use it, that's what closed loop systems do, then we might live in a more sustainable fashion. And this just kind of starts talking about consumption and happiness and how they're related. And there was a really good article that just came out about Americans depressed and suicidal because of our culture, and a lot of this has to do with our consumption culture. So a lot of these articles are just kind of giving you some information on whether consumption is really what we need, or maybe we can move away from that a little bit. And so this is what we'll cover this week. And I'm trying to think what else. So don't forget, you do have quizzes due for the introduction quiz as well, and you don't have a quiz for Tragedy of the Commons, so they're due by Sunday, July 16th by 11:59. Wait, today's Friday, right? Actually, today's the 14th, so I'm sorry, I'm making this video in the middle of the night. So actually, they're due by the 15th, 11:59. So this quiz is due by the 15th, 11:59. And then the ethics, economics, and policy quizzes are due on the 22nd by 11:59. Okay, as we move forward, I'll open sustainability and food on Monday, and then you'll have access to those. Don't forget, coming up, you're going to have to watch Food Incorporated, so please get your hands on that film. Any of the food-related documentaries will probably give you the same sort of content, which is about our industrial food system and how we have moved away from what we consider how our food is grown and now into a manufacturing phase. If you look here under sustainability, you'll see the review for the midterm, and you can start writing out your answers to the midterm exam questions. I'll have more on that video next week. Okay, so have a fantastic week. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out.